The elder council sat in the velvet-lined front row, a wall of rigid tradition that had not moved since the cathedral doors crashed open. Bobby's mother, the matriarch of the syndicate, stared at the three boys. She didn't look at the silk of their suits or the flash of the Rolls-Royce behind them. She looked at their eyes that held the same terrifying obsidian depth as her son's. She looked at the oldest boy's jawline and understood, in a singular, sickening heartbeat, exactly what Agnes's presence meant. It meant 3 years of forged medical records were now worthless. It meant every bribe she had paid to the fertility clinic had just walked into the hall as a living, breathing death sentence for her plans. Beside her, the new bride, a woman chosen for her pure lineage, reached out to steady herself against the mahogany pew. Her hand trembled, but the matriarch didn't offer comfort. She simply stared, feeling the specific, icy chill of a secret that had finally been unearthed. The officiant, a man who had presided over the blood oaths of the city's most dangerous men and had never seen the ruthless king falter, cleared his throat. The sound echoed off the high stone arches. He looked at Bobby, who stood frozen like a statue carved from granite, and whispered in a low, uncertain voice, "Shall we proceed with the vows, sir?" But before we see Bobby's world explode, if you haven't witnessed the betrayal that led to this moment, make sure to check out part 1 on the channel or in the pinned comment. You need to see how they forced Agnes out to truly appreciate the fire she's bringing back. If you're hooked on this throne room drama, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The fallout of this wedding is something you won't want to miss. Now, let's go back to the altar. Bobby didn't look at his bride. He didn't look at the priest. He looked at the front row, at the woman who had whispered for years that Agnes was broken. His mother's face was a mask of calculated calm, but the vein in her temple betrayed the chaos beneath. Bobby's hand, heavy with the weight of the wedding ring, slowly dropped. "Stop," Bobby said. The priest blinked, the words caught in his throat. Bobby turned toward the congregation, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that shook the very foundation of the church. "I said, stop." The red Rolls-Royce cut through the cathedral's shadow like a jagged ruby. As the suicide doors swept open, Agnes emerged, draped in a royal blue gown that felt like a declaration of war. She didn't glance at the guards, the very men who had escorted her out in disgrace 3 years ago. They stood paralyzed, their weapons forgotten as 3 small boys in matching black velvet tuxedos stepped onto the pavement. With chin held high and the weight of a hidden kingdom behind her, Agnes began her walk toward the altar to reclaim a throne they said was never hers. The gold band slipped from Bobby's numb fingers, clattering against the marble floor with a hollow ring that seemed to echo for an eternity. He didn't reach for it. He didn't even breathe. His gaze was locked on the 3 miniature specters marching down the aisle, their small shoulders squared with a defiance he recognized in his own mirror every morning. They were undeniable. The eldest boy moved with the same predatory grace Bobby used to command a boardroom, while the youngest tilted his head with a sharp, inquisitive arrogance that had been the king's trademark since childhood. Looking at them was like seeing his own soul fractured into 3 perfect pieces, preserved in amber for the years he'd been told they didn't exist. The ruthless king, a man who had negotiated with death and bargained with monsters without ever losing his cool, felt the air vanish from his lungs. The carefully constructed walls of his empire, the alliances, the blood oaths, the strategic marriage, crumbled into dust beneath the weight of their gaze. Words, usually his most lethal weapon, failed him completely. For the first time in his life, the man who ruled the city through fear found himself silenced by a truth he wasn't prepared to face. He stood at the center of his grandest stage, a king without a crown, staring at the legacy he had been tricked into throwing away. The silence of the cathedral was brittle, a glass house waiting for the first stone. Agnes reached the altar, her presence a cold front that sent a shiver through the rows of elite guests. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed a heavy manila folder onto the lace-covered altar, the papers sliding across the wood until they bumped against the abandoned wedding ring. Bobby stared at the documents, his vision blurring. On the top page, the bold, clinical seal of a Swiss laboratory stood in stark contrast to the ornate religious setting. He saw the percentages, 99, 9%, repeated 3 times, a rhythmic beating of a heart he thought had been silenced years ago. Beneath the DNA results lay the original, untampered medical files from their marriage, revealing a staggering truth. Her health had been perfect, while his own family's doctors had been quietly correcting the records to weave a narrative of failure. Agnes stepped closer, her scent, a mix of expensive oud and the metallic tang of the rain outside, filling his senses. She leaned in, her voice a sharp, elegant blade that cut through the gasps of the crowd. "I wasn't the infertile one, Bobby," she whispered, her eyes burning with the fire of a woman who had survived a desert of lies. "I was the mother of your sons. You were just too blind to see who was holding the knife at our backs." She stood back, watching the blood drain from his face as he realized that every decision he had made since the divorce had been based on a ghost. The folder remained open between them, a paper trail of a stolen life that no amount of mafia gold could ever buy back. Chaos ignited in the front pews like a spilled canister of gasoline. The bride's father, a man whose power was built on the ironclad promise of this union, surged to his feet, his face a mask of purple rage. "Security, remove this woman and these actors at once," he bellowed, his voice cracking the sacred stillness. Behind him, the bride let out a sharp, hysterical sob, her white veil trembling as she pointed a gloved finger at Agnes. "This is a stunt." A pathetic, low-class lie. Bobby's personal guard, men who had moved like shadows for a decade, took a step forward and then stopped. Their eyes darted from the frantic commands of the bride's family to the three boys standing in the center of the aisle. The old rules of the syndicate were clear. The bloodline was sacred. To touch these children was to touch the king's own marrow. They looked at the oldest boy, who stared back with a cold, unblinking authority that was more Bobby than the man standing at the altar. The cathedral became a cacophony of shouting and shoving. The bride's brothers moved to grab Agnes's arm, but they found themselves staring down the barrels of silence. Bobby's lieutenants hadn't drawn their weapons, but their hands rested heavily on their holsters, their loyalty fractured by the undeniable evidence of the boys' faces. They weren't just guards anymore. They were witnesses to a miracle they had been told was impossible. As the bride's family screamed for an escort, the men who had once bled for Bobby stood like stone sentinels, refusing to move against the queen who had returned with the crown jewels of the empire. The noise of the riot faded into a dull, underwater hum as Bobby's gaze drifted from the screaming bride to the front row. His mother sat perfectly still, her spine a rod of iron, her eyes fixed forward as if she could ignore the truth into non-existence. Beside her, Jin, the man Bobby had called brother since they were boys, the man who handled every sensitive detail of the syndicate, avoided his eyes, his knuckles white against the mahogany pew. The realization hit Bobby with the force of a lead pipe to the gut. The doctor he had trusted had been Jin's cousin. The specialists who had delivered the devastating news of Agnes's infertility had been handpicked by his mother. It wasn't a medical tragedy. It was a surgical extraction of his happiness. They hadn't seen a woman he loved. They had seen a complication to the lineage. They had deemed his sons unfit before they were even conceived, all to preserve a vision of a pure empire that existed only in their twisted, archaic dreams. Bobby looked at Jin, and for the first time, he saw the shadow behind the man's loyalty. Every word of comfort Jin had offered after the divorce, every drink he'd poured to help Bobby forget the barren woman he'd lost, it was all part of the theater. His own shadow had helped his mother cut out his heart. The air in the cathedral grew thin, hot with the friction of a decade of trust turning to ash. He wasn't surrounded by advisors. He was surrounded by architects of a 3-year-old lie. The king wasn't losing his mind. He was finally seeing the monsters who had shared his table. Agnes didn't wait for a confession or a crown. She had delivered her verdict, and the wreckage she left behind was no longer her concern. With a sharp, regal nod to her sons, she turned her back on the altar, the heavy silk of her blue gown snapping like a flag in a storm. The three boys followed in perfect, disciplined formation, their small footsteps echoing against the stunned silence of the guests. They moved toward the light of the open doors, leaving the ruthless king, standing in the ruins of a life he no longer recognized. The heavy thud of the cathedral doors closing behind them snapped the tether holding Bobby in place. "Bobby, wait!" his mother hissed, her hand reaching out to snag his sleeve, but he ripped himself away with a snarl that silenced the entire room. He didn't look back at the sobbing woman in white or the traitors in the front row. He ran. The sound of his dress shoes pounding against the marble was the only noise in the vast hall as he sprinted past the paralyzed guards. He burst through the entrance just as the red Rolls-Royce hummed to life, its engine a low, predatory growl against the evening air. The suicide doors clicked shut, sealing his family away from him once more. "Agnes!" he roared, his voice cracking against the stone facade. The car began to roll, its tires crunching over the gravel toward the iron gates. Bobby didn't stop. He pushed his lungs to the bursting point, sprinting down the grand driveway, his tuxedo jacket flapping in the wind. He was a man who had spent his life chasing power, but as he reached for the retreating polished chrome of the bumper, he realized he was finally chasing the only thing that actually mattered. He reached the gate just as the car cleared the threshold, his fingers grazing the cold metal before the red taillights vanished into the blur of the city traffic. The rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets by the time Bobby tracked the GPS signal to a nondescript, high-security villa on the outskirts of the city. He didn't knock. He practically broke the door down, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his wedding shirt soaked through and clinging to his skin. He stopped dead when he saw her. Agnes was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of dark wine in her hand, looking out at the skyline with a calm that made his frantic heartbeat feel like an insult. "I didn't think you'd make it past the first gate," she said, her voice like velvet-wrapped steel. She didn't turn around. She told him how she had fled to London 3 years ago with nothing but a suitcase and the terrifying knowledge that his family would see her children as threats, to be eliminated or assets to be seized. She had built a life in the shadows of Mayfair, raising 3 princes in a fortress of her own making, far from the reach of the men who called themselves his brothers. Bobby stepped toward her, his hands trembling. "Agnes, I'll fix this. I'll give you everything. The empire, the protection." "You still don't get it," she interrupted, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were devoid of the warmth he remembered. "I didn't come back to reclaim a husband or a life in your world. I came to show you the cost of your blindness. I came so you could see exactly what you've lost, and to tell you that you will never, ever have them." She set the glass down with a final, clinical click. "You chose the crown, Bobby. Now you can rule your empty kingdom alone." The ruthless king returned to the cathedral not as a groom, but as an executioner. The wedding guests had fled, leaving only the inner circle and the elders of the council huddled in the flickering candlelight of the nave. Bobby walked down the center aisle, the gold ring he had dropped now crushed beneath the heel of his boot. He didn't offer an ultimatum. He didn't ask for explanations. He simply drew his weapon and laid it on the very altar where his life had been dismantled. "You told me she was a ghost," Bobby whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal, quiet intensity. "You told me my blood ended with me." His mother tried to speak, her mouth opening to offer another elegant lie about tradition and legacy. But Bobby raised a hand, silencing the woman who had birthed him and betrayed him in the same breath. With a single nod to the few lieutenants whose loyalty had shifted the moment they saw the boys' faces, the purge began. One by one, he stripped the elders of their titles, their holdings, and their protection. He set fire to the ledgers of the old world, metaphorically and literally, as the council's headquarters were razed to the ground before the sun could rise. He knew this meant war, that the rival syndicates would see this internal slaughter as a moment of weakness. He didn't care. If the throne was built on the bones of his children's future, he would burn the throne to ash. He was clearing a path through the graveyard of his own history, making sure that when he finally stood before Agnes again, there would be no shadows left to hide in. He was no longer protecting an empire. He was hunting the monsters who had tried to steal his fatherhood. The war was still screaming in the streets, but inside the villa, the silence was absolute. Bobby sat in the dim light of the study, his knuckles bruised and his spirit fractured, when the heavy oak door creaked open. It wasn't the guard or the mother he expected. It was the youngest, the one with the sharp, obsidian eyes and the small, defiant chin that mirrored Bobby's own. The boy didn't hesitate. He walked straight into the center of the room, standing small but unshakable against the shadow of the man who ruled the city. The boy's gaze traveled over Bobby's tattered tuxedo and the hollow exhaustion in his eyes. There was no fear in the child, only a piercing, ancient curiosity that made the king feel smaller than he ever had in a boardroom. "Mom said you were a king," the boy whispered, his voice steady despite the chaos of the night. He took a step closer, his small hands balled into fists at his sides. "She said kings protect people. So why did you let them hurt us? Why did you leave us alone in the dark for so long?" The question hit Bobby harder than any bullet ever could. It stripped away the titles, the wealth, and the terrifying reputation of the syndicate. He looked at his son, the living evidence of his failure, and felt the crushing weight of 3 lost years. There was no mafia logic that could answer a child's pain. For the first time, the king sank to his knees, lowering himself until he was at eye level with the boy. He didn't offer a royal decree or a hollow promise. He looked into his own eyes reflected in the child's face and realized that being a king meant nothing if he couldn't be a father. "I was blind," Bobby choked out, his voice thick with a grief he had never allowed himself to feel. "But I'm wide awake now, and I'm never letting go again." The smoke of the old world still clung to Bobby's skin as he stood before Agnes for the final time. The council was gone, the traitors exiled, and the blood-soaked traditions that had nearly cost him his soul were buried in the ruins of the cathedral. He had settled the war not with a white flag, but with a total restructuring of the city's power. He was no longer the king of a shadow syndicate. He had converted his holdings into a legitimate global empire, stripping away the violence to build a fortress of security and wealth that his sons could inherit without shame. He found Agnes in the garden of the villa, the 3 boys playing in the distance under the watchful eyes of guards who now answered only to her. Bobby didn't approach with the arrogance of a ruler. He came with the humility of a man who had finally found his North Star. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands empty, his heart open. "Old throne is ash, Agnes," he said, his voice steady but softened by a new, quiet strength. "There are no more secrets, no more shadows. I've ended the cycle." He looked at the boys, his sons, and then back to the woman who had survived his greatest mistake. He didn't ask for her forgiveness. He knew that was a debt that could only be paid in time. Instead, he made a vow that carried more weight than any oath he'd ever sworn to the syndicate. "I spent 3 years being the man they wanted me to be. I will spend the rest of my life being the man you deserved. Even if it takes 1,000 years for you to believe me, I'm not going anywhere." Agnes looked at him, and for the first time, the ice in her gaze began to thaw into the possibility of a new beginning. The Mafia king was dead. The father had finally come home.